Our reading today comes from Brad Aaron Modlin. And in the spirit of redefining success, he shares this poem, "What You Missed That Day You Were Absent," from 4th grade. Mrs. Nelson explained how to stand still and how to listen to the wind and how you can find meaning in pumping gas and how peeling potatoes even can be a form of prayer. She took questions on how not to feel lost in the dark, and after lunch she distributed worksheets that covered ways to remember your grandfather's voice. And then the class had a discussion about falling asleep without feeling like you had maybe forgotten to do something else, perhaps something important, and how to believe that the house you then wake up in is truly your home. Now this prompted Mrs. Nelson to draw a chalkboard diagram detailing exactly how to chant the Psalms during cigarette breaks, and how not to squirm for sound when your thoughts are all that you hear. Also, that you have enough. The English lesson that day was that I am is a complete sentence. And then just before the afternoon bell, she made the math equation look easy. The one that proves that hundreds of questions we have, and feeling cold, and all those nights spent looking for whatever it was that you lost, and one person, they all add up to something. I love Adrienne Marie Brown's redefinition of success: to root ourselves in communities that are attending to the crises
Recording
of our
in
time.
progress.
She goes on to ask this question: how can we, the future ancestors, align ourselves with the most resilient practices of our species? Now, I grew up just outside of Chicago, and I moved here to the Boston area in the year 2000 to attend Berkeley, where Crystal Linda goes, and to get a degree in hand drumming, of all things. Anybody else here have a hand drumming degree? Okay, it's just me then. All right. I had this dream at the time of being a touring musician. I wanted to play with some famous band, traveling the world in a different city every night of the week, playing to crowds of thousands, of course. And in my last semester of school, at a time when I was spending a lot of time trying to imagine this musician's life ahead of me, I remember that I stepped into a classroom in the percussion department, which is always in the basement. I stepped into this classroom where two of my professors were having a conversation together. One of them was talking about his schedule. He had just come back from a 2-week concert tour of Morocco, playing with some incredible Middle Eastern band. And he was just about to head off on another 4-week tour of Europe, playing with a group called Simon and Garfunkel. Oh, have you heard of them? He pointed to his suitcase, which was sitting open in the corner of the room. It was this incredible, tangible symbol of success. I could only imagine that suitcase was traveling on this trip with him. It was incredible to me. I couldn't even picture a more perfect life. And so I asked him, I kind of interrupted, and I said, are you so freaking excited that you can't even stand it? And yeah, I really said it just kind of like that, with no chill. But he looked at me and he just kind of shook his head and he sighed a little bit and he said, man, I just want to go home and see my kid. At the time, he was living in Ohio and he commuted to Boston to teach in between concert tours. And when he said that, well, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't say it, but what I thought was, surely your kid is not as cool as Simon and Garfunkel. But I knew enough not to say it, and I was embarrassed by how much I had missed the tone of the conversation they were having. That open suitcase had just a moment ago been the ultimate sign of success, but it carried a very different weight when I looked back at it again. The reality of his life was more complex than I could have imagined at the time. This man knew the value of music, the power of music to transform and to connect. He knew it as well as anyone I have ever met. And even still, he struggled to balance his love and passion for music and his career and the good work he did with the value of his family and his community and home. My unfolding sense of true success, of a life well lived, is first that it is a journey and not a destination, and that it is second an increasing embrace of one's values, even in the face of increasing complexity. This reminds me of a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye called Famous. She says, "The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is only famous to floors. I want to be famous in the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it ever did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do." Remembering what we can do in the midst of all that must be done in this world, that is the work of we, the future ancestors, dear ones. Rabbi Tarfon spoke of this in the 1st century AD in his own tradition. He said, "It's not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting this world, but you are not free to desist from it either." Now, sometimes when I think of success, I think of this very useful word that millennials have coined, adulting. A word that celebrates the daily successes of small things. To recognize that it is a victory if one can accomplish the shopping of the groceries and the laundering of the laundry all in a single day. Adulting, to be sure. But in congregations like this one, we who covenant to live for love and for justice, we know that success in its true sense is more than checking off to-do lists, and it's more even than professional acclaim. My hope for my days and for yours is that we can attend to the complexity of our times with our best selves, that we can root ourselves in communities doing our best to honor our ancestors and all future generations to come. This is the work of we, the future ancestors. My hope for us is that we can find a way to set aside the simplistic stories we've been told about who we are or who we're meant to be. Set aside the stories we've been told along the way or made up along the way about what success is supposed to look like, or what our gender is supposed to mean, or what kind of work has value enough, or whether systems of injustice are tolerable just because they are normal. Growing up at any age is about growing into our values, about adapting to a changing world with grace and with courage, and about remembering what we can do even in the overwhelming list of all that must be done. And when I think of redefining success to align with our values, and when I think of movement ancestors who lived into the complexity of their own times, I sometimes remember this story by our Unitarian ancestor, William Ellery Channing. Channing was a preacher in Boston in the mid-1800s over at Arlington Street Church, and he is remembered as one of the great founders of Unitarianism. He's hailed as a model of religious leadership in his time. He was dedicated to justice, and he became a powerful voice for abolition. But we know that success, friends, is more about the journey than the destination, and that was true even for our friend Will. He wasn't always so vocal in his opposition to slavery. He always disagreed with slavery, but he thought that the abolitionists at the time, those who were most pushing the cause, were just going about it wrong. He thought they were too emotional and too passionate, and it reminded him of the overly emotional itinerant revivalists that were sweeping the country at the time. Now, you should know that the only constant in my life since college is my job as an itinerant revivalist, but that's okay. I don't take his comments personally. So one night at this forum, all night, Channing had been complaining about the movement, complaining about the organization and their tactics and their strategy and how they didn't work together well enough and how complicated the whole thing was. And eventually, another man named Samuel May, a more active abolitionist, a leader in the movement, got tired of listening to his criticisms. Eventually, he was unable to control his impatience, and he interrupted, starting to shout, "Dr. Channing, I am tired of these complaints. It is not our fault that those who might have conducted this great reform so much more prudently than we have left us to manage as we may. It is not our fault that those who might have pleaded for the enslaved so much more wisely and eloquently than we can have been silent. We are not to blame, sir, that you have not spoken. And now that inferior men have begun to speak and begun to act against what you acknowledge to be an awful system, well, it is not becoming of you to complain of us that we do it in an inferior style." This is what the kids would call a sick burn. So sick, in fact, that Channing was unable to answer the rebuke. And he thought for a moment, and he said, "Brother May, I have been silent too long." Now, I love that the story depicts the very moment that Channing took up the work of a life that would resonate with his ancestors and we, the future generations. The very moment that he took up the work of attending to the crises of his time, not to perfect it, but neither to desist from it. To take on the work that was his to do, despite the complexity of working with imperfect people, in imperfect organizations, in an imperfect movement. And I love this story because I so often feel like I'm in Samuel May's place. So often I end up fighting so-called allies who theoretically share my values, but they would rather criticize the work from afar than get scuffed up in the fray themselves, having to make the difficult decisions. And I love this story also because I'm just as often in Channing's place. Too often I've blamed other people's failings for my own silence. And too often I have delayed action, leaving my human family to suffer for the sake of some abstract sense of moral purity. We should be cautious when we criticize or praise those who attended to the crises of their time so many years ago. Looking back into history, it's easy to see what they should have done. It's easy to simplify the complexities and make it an easy decision for them. But it was just as tough for them often as it is for us today to find a way forward, to find the people to work with and the ways to move justice forward. And we should remember that the 13th Amendment that eventually outlawed slavery left an exception for those who were found guilty of a crime. It left a loophole in our abolition of slavery. And then suspiciously, our country began to accuse more people of crimes than just about any other. So that today we are only 5% of the world's population and 20% of its prisoners are held in the United States. A report by the ACLU found that just last year in 2022, forced labor in U.S. prisons generated $11 billion worth of goods, while paying out an average of 13 cents to 52 cents per hour. Maybe Channing had missed that day in school, the day when the teacher explained that the hundreds of questions we have about how to go about our days, they add up to something, even if simplistic answers are elusive to us. Friends, our children will someday tell similar stories of us. They will tell stories of the 2020s when a pandemic arrived and devastated our communities, and then climate chaos arrived and devastated our communities, and they will tell of how premeditated wealth inequality made all of these crises difficult to address. They will tell of a time when we put our neighbors in cages by the millions for nonviolent offenses, and how we institutionalized racial segregation in our structures of housing and school, in our prison system, certainly. I hope our children will have other stories to tell, though. Stories of Black Lives Matter, stories of the Me Too movement and the Sunrise movement, of the future ancestors that changed how the story ends. I hope they will tell the story of those of us in communities like this that came together even when the people were complicated, even when the work was imperfect, even when the path forward was unclear. I hope they will tell the story of those of us who covenanted to never forget what we could do, even when the list of all that must be done seemed overwhelming. Writer and atheist prophet Ta-Nehisi Coates spoke of this in a letter to his son when he said, "History is not solely in your hands, but still you are called to struggle, not because it assures you victory, but because it's what assures you an honorable and a sane life." Now, friends, there was a time that I believed success was traveling the world with some famous band. And, well, between you and me, if Paul Simon called me up this afternoon, I'd be on the next plane out of here. But I now recognize that it's something more than that as well. That success can mean finding a way to support your family even when the minimum wage is too low and healthcare costs are too high. And it's finding a way to make the world better even when we have more questions about it than answers. And it's finding a way to work with imperfect people in imperfect communities to find a way forward even when the path is unclear. So let us live deeply into the journey, friends, the journey we will not forget. Let us aspire to the fame of the boot and the buttonhole, never forgetting what we can do. And let us love each other deeply, building up the messy and complicated communities that make this life worth celebrating. Let us imagine a world of justice and equity and compassion, and let us come together to do together what we would not do alone and make it real. May it be so, and may we make it so.